All right, let's jump right into this explainer. We're looking at a pretty wild era where a completely massive, seemingly invincible empire just falls apart. It created this chaotic power vacuum that totally reshaped the Indian subcontinent. We're talking about a profound transition here, an era where emperors literally became puppets, prime ministers became kings, and a fractured landscape unwittingly paved the way for foreign colonial rule. To really wrap our heads around the scale of this, let's track a dramatic 150-year stretch of shifting borders and intense conflict. It kicks off in 1707 with the death of the last great Mughal emperor, Aurangzeb, and wraps up in 1857 when the Mughal dynasty officially ends. In between, the subcontinent gets rocked by devastating foreign invasions, monumental clashes like the Battle of Panipat, and the slow, steady creep of British influence starting around the Battle of Plassey. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the crumbling Mughal Empire and why the giant fell, followed by the scramble of regional powers. Then we'll zero in on the mighty Marathas, the rise of the Peshwas, and finally, the fractured subcontinent.
So, part 1, the crumbling Mughal Empire, a giant losing its grip.
Picture this. At its absolute peak, the Mughal Empire controlled practically the entire Indian subcontinent. I mean, they were incredibly wealthy and seemed completely untouchable. But, as we know, size doesn't always equal strength. The real turning point, 1707. Without Aurangzeb, the empire was suddenly hit with a disastrous leadership crisis. What you get is a rapid, chaotic succession of weak rulers wasting time and money on bloody wars for the throne. In just a few decades, these absolute monarchs turned into literal figureheads, basically puppets being controlled by their own nobles.
Which brings us to part 2. Why the giant fell and diagnosing the rot.
It's kind of the ultimate historical mystery, isn't it? How exactly does a superpower with centuries of massive wealth, huge armies, and brilliant administration just dismantle itself? Well, it doesn't happen overnight, and it's almost never just one thing. Let's look at the symptoms. The causes were deeply systemic. You had the nobility totally fracturing into these treacherous competing factions. Some even became literal kingmakers, like the Syed brothers, who were just installing and assassinating emperors whenever they felt like it. Wild, right? And while they're busy fighting each other, their military is completely failing to modernize against new European artillery. Throw in Aurangzeb's orthodox religious policies, like bringing back the jizya tax and destroying temples, and you've successfully alienated absolutely crucial allies, like the Rajputs, the Sikhs, and the Marathas. But honestly, the absolute biggest bottleneck was something called the Jagirdari crisis. Now, a jagir was essentially a land grant given to a noble instead of a regular cash salary. Makes total sense, right? Until the empire stops expanding and you run out of profitable land. So what do the nobles do? To squeeze money out of the land they did have, they ruthlessly overtaxed the peasants. This absolutely wrecked agriculture and state revenue alike, starving the treasury and pushing the whole empire way past the point of no return. Moving on to part 3, the rise of regional powers and the scramble for the vacuum. So, with the Mughals completely paralyzed on the inside, their weakness was totally exposed to the outside world. Enter the Persian ruler Nadir Shah in 1739. He invades, easily crushes the Mughal army, and just loots Delhi. When the provincial Mughal governors saw that the capital couldn't protect or control them anymore, they realized they could just run their own shows. They transformed into autonomous kings. Sure, they kept the old administrative structure and paid lip service to the emperor on paper, but make no mistake, they were entirely independent. This whole scramble left the map highly fragmented into 3 different types of states. First up, you've got the successor states like Bengal, Awadh, and Hyderabad. These were basically the former loyal governors who just broke away. Second, the independent kingdoms, groups like the Rajputs, Sikhs, and Marathas, who had always resisted Mughal control and finally seized their moment. And third, entirely new states like Mysore, which popped up purely out of rebellion and brand new military leadership. Let's zoom in on part 4, the mighty Marathas, the closest contenders. Without a doubt, the most formidable faction in this whole chaotic scramble were the Marathas. Founded by Shivaji Maharaj, they came out of the Deccan Plateau using these brilliant rapid-fire guerrilla warfare tactics. But how do you fund endless military campaigns? Well, the Marathas relied heavily on a very specific number, 25%. They created this demanding tax called the chowth. basically extracting exactly a quarter of the land revenue from any surrounding territory. If you paid the chowth, you were safe from Maratha raids. It was essentially an aggressive, highly effective protection racket that fueled their continuous expansion. And when you compare them side by side, it's totally clear why the Marathas succeeded where the Mughals failed. Think about it. The Mughals were this rigid, top-down bureaucracy leaning heavily on slow-moving infantry and clunky artillery. The Marathas were the exact opposite. They were a decentralized confederacy united by the Marathi language, and they completely dominated using lightning-fast cavalry raids. The giant, heavy Mughal war machine literally just couldn't catch them. That brings us to Part 5, Rise of the Peshwas, where the prime ministers take charge. See, the Marathas were actually going through an internal revolution of their own. As Shivaji's direct descendants slowly lost their grip, real power shifted away from the royal throne over to the city of Pune, directly into the hands of the prime ministers, known as the Peshwas. Under these incredibly sharp leaders, the Marathas stopped just being a raiding nuisance and morphed into a highly structured confederation, custom-built to rival Delhi for total control of the subcontinent. And nobody sums up this aggressive northern expansion quite like Bajirao I, arguably the most famous and militarily brilliant Peshwa. He had this legendary metaphor declaring, "Strike at the trunk of the withering Mughal tree." The idea being, if you chop the trunk, the branches, meaning the regional governors, are going to fall on their own. He was aiming his cavalry straight at the dying heart of the Mughal Empire. So, under the Peshwas, Maratha influence absolutely exploded across India. But there was a major catch. Spreading out that far meant they had to decentralize their administration. The empire ended up splitting into a loosely knit confederation of 5 major aristocratic houses, like the Scindias in Gwalior and the Holkars in Indore. Now, sure, this let them grow super fast, but it was also a massive structural weakness. Their unity was basically hanging by a thread. Which sets the stage for Part 6, the fractured subcontinent and the disastrous climax. Everything collides in the year 1761. This is the climax that completely shattered the dream of united Maratha-ruled India. See, the Marathas were relentlessly pushing north into the Punjab region, which directly threatened the powerhouse Afghan ruler Ahmad Shah Abdali. That friction sparked a catastrophic military showdown, the Third Battle of Panipat. Guys, this wasn't just a minor skirmish. It was literally one of the largest, bloodiest clashes of the entire 18th century. And despite having huge numbers, the Marathas suffered an absolutely devastating defeat, mostly due to 4 major missteps. First, their aggressive taxation had burned bridges with local allies like the Rajputs, leaving them totally isolated. Second, fighting way outside their home turf, they ran into severe supply shortages. Basically, they were starving. Third, they made massive strategic blunders, inexplicably abandoning their tried-and-true guerrilla tactics. And finally, they were just outplayed by Abdali's highly disciplined Afghan forces. This massive loss deeply fractured the Maratha unity and stopped their dominance dead in its tracks. So looking back, what is the true legacy of the falling Mughal giant? The 18th century became this era of extreme political fragmentation. All these regional powers were desperately trying to build their own empires, but their endless internal rivalries meant nobody could actually unite the subcontinent. And here's the ultimate twist. While all these Indian powers were exhausting themselves fighting each other, they were unwittingly rolling out the red carpet for a brand new foreign corporate power, the British East India Company. Was a century of civil war just the ultimate setup for colonial rule? That's a thought to hold on